Good morning. My name is Justin Long. I'm the Director of Research for Beyond, and I work with the 2414 Global Initiative to track movements worldwide. This morning, we're going to be looking at my dashboard, which reports on the number of movements, the number of believers in those movements, and where around the world they're located. So let's just dive into the numbers. First off, a few small notes. I am reporting what gets reported to me by the various networks and movements around the world. Not just anybody can report. We have a relationship with certain of the networks, and they're in what we call webs of accountability. So there's outside confirmation, there's some level of auditing. You don't just take every report off the internet, but we are basically reporting what they are reporting to us, as all Christian demography is done worldwide in that way. Second off, I am documenting what is happening around the world. I'm obviously not claiming credit for all of this. Neither is Beyond claiming credit for all of this. There are roughly 35 movement families around the world. God is doing some amazing things, even in places that we obviously don't have any documentation for. A word about security. Many people tell me things about movements, and then they tell me that I can't share those things about movements. So it makes reporting a little bit difficult. Basically, what we've agreed to in the 2414 Coalition is that all of our data gets rolled up, if you will, to the regional and to the global level. So, for example, I will report at Southeast Asia or South Asia or North America or parts of Europe, but I won't report on specific countries or specific people groups because that starts to get into sensitive information. So everything that I share that I'm allowed to share is basically at the country or at the global and at the regional level, and I don't share anything at the country and people group level. We define a movement as 4 generations of believers, something that's reached 4 generations and beyond, and is continuing to add additional generations every 18 months to 2 years, something in that area. Most of the movements do not have a minimum number of believers for that level. But if you get to 4 generations in multiple streams, so not just me making a disciple who makes a disciple who makes a disciple, but maybe me who makes 3 disciples who lead groups, and those 3 groups in turn lead 3 groups, and it begins to stretch out. If you get to that level at 4 generations, you're usually around 1,000 believers. If you're not over the 1,000 believer line, then you're pretty close to it. And the movements that do have minimum requirements for reporting will report if a movement's over 1,000 believers. There's a CPM continuum, and this particular slide that's on my screen right now has this continuum. That's how we measure progress amongst all of the movements. The continuum, it's a scale. It runs from 1 to 7. So 1 means there's a team in place, and there's variations of 1, like 1.1, 1.2. There's a team in place that is attempting to start a movement amongst a particular place or people group. And then 2, 3, 4 is second, third, fourth generation fruit has been seen. 5 is where we have a movement, a consistent movement at 4th generation and beyond. 6 means it's completely under indigenous and local leadership and very well sustained over time. And 7 means that movement has started other movements. So the scale runs from 1 to 7, from initial engagement all the way through this movement's actually sending workers to other places to start new things. We measure the boundaries of movements mostly by country, sometimes by, in big countries, by province or by city, and sometimes by people group. So for example, we could have, say, a half dozen movements in, we'll just hypotheticalize. We'll have a half dozen movements in America. Some of those might be amongst various people groups, right? So like a movement amongst Pashtos in North America, a movement amongst Hindi speakers in North America. Or it might be by city. It might be a movement in New York or Atlanta or Washington, D.C. The different movements report in different ways. Usually, if it's a major city, they'll report according to a province or a city, and oftentimes by people group instead. So there's this mix that's going on because there's a tendency to understand that we have to start incorporating cities into the mix of measurement as well as people groups. Many cities are large mishmashes, if you will, large mixes of people groups, and you can't really distinguish where one people group begins and one people group ends in a major city. So the movements that target cities report that way, and the movements that target people groups report that way. So with all of those numbers said, with all those notes said, here are the actual numbers for movements worldwide. So right now we have nearly 4,600, 4,589 teams, engagements, something between level 1 and level 7 documented around the world. So that's anywhere from a team that just started trying to start a movement all the way up to a reproducing movement that's starting other movements. So 4,600 active movement engagements. Of those, 1,369, somewhere close to 1,400. That number's obviously changing all the time as engagements become movements and movements start new movements. So right now what we've documented is 1,369 movements around the world that have reached level 5. They've reached 4 generations. They've reached somewhere around 1,000 believers in the world. We know of 18 that reached full movement stage and then ended. That's obviously a bit of a floor. That's what we know about. This does not count the teams that went and tried to start something and didn't get something started and then reached the limit. Maybe their visa ran out, maybe their funding ran out, whatever happened, and they came home. So we're not counting those, but because we don't know those. But of the ones that reached level 5, a full-blown movement, we know of 18 that ended. Of those 18 that ended, we know that the vast majority actually went on to see new movements start. So, for example, there was one movement that I know of that ended, and it basically there was some outside funding that got lost, and when that got lost, some of the workers had to go home, and so that movement ended, so to speak. But actually, what happened was the official movement ended, and out of that came 3 different new movements that basically splintered off, if you will, or became new movements on their own with these 3 different leaders. And they all still continue to know each other and work together to some extent, but they're 3 separate movements now. So the believers in these 18 movement, I tended to call them fizzles, these 18 movements that stop, the believers in those movements don't go away. They just become part of new structures. So if we look at these movements by continuum stage in this graph, you see that the vast majority, about 1,500 or so, are at the pre-stage. They're at the level 1 stage. They're just getting started. Then we see that a similar number, somewhere around 1,300 or so, are in the emerging category. They've seen 2nd, 3rd, 4th generation level fruit, but they're not full-blown movements yet. And then we see these 1,369 that are at the full movement stage, and then a much smaller number that are at the sustained stage. So what we see here is actually that, yes, there are 1,300 or 1,400 movements in the world, but there are an even larger number, another 2 times that number, if you will, that are steadily marching toward becoming movements. These emerging ones could be full-blown movements in the next 2 years, 3 years. Many of the movements at level 5 could become level 6s and level 7s in the next 2 years. When this happens, it's going to be a remarkable change that we see in our world. This is going to be a huge and even, dare I say, nation-shaping change that happens. As I said, there are 34, 35, we're tracking about 34 right now, large movement networks. That means there are these families, if you will. Beyond is one of them. Some other agencies are some of these networks. They are groups of movements. So some of these are focused on particular geographic regions, like, say, North Africa or South Africa or West or South Asia or something like that. Some of these, a handful of these, span multiple countries and multiple regions. But they're all connected to each other, and they tend to collaborate back and forth and help each other. In these movements, there are 76.9, nearly 77 million believers right now, which is an awesome number. That means that in our world, on our planet right now, of all the people on our planet, nearly 1 out of 100 people, not just believers, but 1 out of 100 people on our planet are believers in a rapidly multiplying movement, mostly in amongst unreached peoples and places. 1% of our planet belong to these movements. And as these movements grow, that number could very readily reach 2% in a very short time. As I said, this is a nation-shaping, this is a world-shaping kind of event that is happening right now. If you take the total number of believers and you divide them out amongst the total number of movements, we average about 56,000 believers per movement. Now that's a mean or an average. Obviously, there's a lot of movements that are smaller in the 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 believer category, and there's a handful of movements that are far larger. The largest movement in the world numbers something around 15 million believers in size and has been going now for over 20 years. So some of the movements are quite large. Some of the movements are still rather small, and the mean right here is in the middle. There are about 4.8 million known churches or house groups amongst these believers. So the 76, 77 million believers are in nearly 5 million house churches. It's not quite an apples to oranges comparison, but there are as many house churches in these movements as there are churches in the world. Mainstream churches, building churches in the world. So it's a really pretty amazing phenomenon that's happening. This averages out to about 16 believers per house church, per house group. Now, there are some countries where the number is far smaller, say even as low as 3 to 5 because of the security situation. It's difficult for people to gather together. In some places, the number can be larger. There are some churches within the movement within various movements that might average 200, 300, 400 believers in a church. It's grown that large. But for the most part, most movements are in places where it's logistically difficult or security-wise it's difficult to have larger communities of believers. And so they tend to meet house to house. So small house groups, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 believers. Across the world, out of the Joshua Project's 255 clusters, roughly 185 people group clusters are engaged. So we know across the world there's thousands of people groups, but for the sake of some simplicity, we tend to group these people groups into what are called clusters. And Joshua Project has about 255 of these clusters defined. So, Turkic world and various Chinese world and other worlds are broken out, affinity blocks are broken out into clusters. And 185 of these clusters are engaged right now. Most of those are the less reached clusters that are engaged. So we see there's a huge ethnographic dispersion across the world that these movements are involved in. This is a floor number, not a ceiling, right? So this is not the absolute top. All we've documented is what I refer to as the floor, but there are at least 1,140 people groups. Most of these are unreached people groups that are engaged by movements. Now, there's certainly more than 1,140 people groups. Some of the movements don't report all of the people groups they've engaged. Some movements actually don't really report the number of people groups at all. They report at the cluster level or at the province level. So we know there's more than that, but we know of at least 1,100 people groups that are engaged by movements. We also know that of the languages that are spoken in countries, so like Kazakh in Kazakhstan or Kazakh in Germany or Kazakh in China, we know of at least 2,188 languages, nearly 2,200 languages that are presently engaged by these movements. We've also begun tracking, and this is very early stages, but we've begun tracking the provinces that are engaged below the country level down to the province level, because we want to make sure that countries are being adequately engaged overall. And we know of at least 255 provinces that are engaged. Now, that's a very rough number. It's a very early number. But given that there are somewhere around 4,000 provinces in the world, 255 is a pretty amazing number to know right now. And nearly all of those are unreached provinces. I haven't even really begun trying to track the provinces in places like North America or Europe or Southern Africa that are being engaged by these groups. This graph tells us the engagements in affinity blocks. So there are a handful of affinity blocks that cover the entire world, and you can see here the broad ethnographic dispersion of movements around the world. Now, obviously, the big blocks here are Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and the Arab world. But no affinity block is untouched at this point. And the others are rapidly growing as well. So Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia affinity blocks, these are clusters within the affinity blocks. That's the places where movements have been active the longest. It's been remarkable growth amongst the Arab world, but there's also a significant amount of work being done in other more reached areas. So it's just interesting to see the broad response across the entire world. This next chart is geographic in nature, and it shows us the dispersion of movements across the world. Now, again, you'll see Africa and Asia have the largest number of movements and largest number of engagements. And the reality is movements basically got started in Asia. They got started mostly in Southern Asia. And for a long time, people said, well, movements work there, but they won't work where I'm working. They won't work here in Africa. And then somebody went and tried it, and they said, well, lo and behold, yes, it does work in Africa. And then people said, well, it won't really work it'll work in Africa and Asia, but it won't really work here in Europe. And then somebody went and tried it, and lo and behold, it does work to some extent in Europe and North America. And now we have engagements as far out as the Pacific Islands. So the only UN regions at this point that lack any movement at all is this little UN region of Polynesia, which is a small island chains in the Pacific. Elsewhere, there are engagements. There are the beginnings, at least, of movements in every UN region around the world. This works everywhere. So this next slide are the clusters in the world that have 10 plus engagements. So these clusters are basically heavily engaged right now. So you can see the broad dispersion here, and there are some names that you'll probably recognize on this chart. Then we move on to show you the increase in movements over time. So what we asked was, of each movement, what year did you begin? And we're tracking the total number of movements that began over the period of time. Now, not all of the movements have reported in. So we don't have all of the data in on this, so it's based on a subset of the movements. But because this data spans multiple regions, it spans multiple countries, and it spans multiple people group clusters, I believe this is a pretty accurate curve for how movements have grown over time. Notice that this is, not especially an exponential curve. We are not yet really seeing the starting movements thing take off totally. It is more one movement starts another movement kind of approach, a one by one kind of thing. But still, we see steadily increasing growth over time. The next slide, we look at the increase in churches. Now, here we do see this exponential power graph start to take off, and you would expect that because movements, by their very nature, because they multiply churches, because disciples make disciples, and churches make churches, and leaders make leaders. You will see this multiplying effect, and that's what we see here. So from very small number of churches in 1995, we've grown to a very large number of churches in 2020. And I'm trying to track this on 5-year increments to show the growth over time. Finally, we get to this slide that has clusters with very few engagements. Now, these are the places that we still need workers to go. These are the places where we still need engagements. There are a lot of obvious names on this list. There are names that have been on these kinds of lists forever. I've been doing missions research now for 20 plus years, and many of these names have been on those lists for that entire time period. So This is not to say that these clusters are not engaged at all. These are clusters that are less than 5% Christian and have fewer than 5 engagements. Some of these have 1 or 2 teams engaging them. So it's not to say that there's 0 engagements here, but all of these are significantly under-engaged and desperately need more workers. So if you're contemplating new activity, to me, these are the clusters that are the biggest priorities right now. These are the clusters where we really need to see more workers going. And in some cases, obviously, these are very difficult clusters. They're hard to get to. They're hard to engage with. There's security issues. There's logistical issues. So, yeah. Finally, we have 65 countries that have no movement engagements. Now, I don't really view this as a huge issue because most of those 65 countries are high percent Christian countries. They're the countries that are significantly reached already, that have significant Christian work already in them. So these are not necessarily unreached countries without engagements. It's just out of the 240 odd countries in the world, 65 have no teams at all. There are 68 people group clusters that have no movement engagements. Some of these were on that previous slide that I showed you, and some of these are more reached people group clusters, which maybe don't need a movement team, or at least it's not a pressing priority. So our progress, in summary, is that East Africa and portions of Southern Asia are mostly engaged by DMM teams, and there are a few gaps. So if you're going to work in Eastern Africa or in Southern Asia, you really need to be coordinating with existing networks that are on the ground. There's some huge efforts that are underway in these places. There are some places, West Africa, Southeast Asia, Central Asia, Western Asia, there are some of these places that have a lot of engagements. They've got a lot of work going on, but there's still a lot of gaps happening. So you really should be aware of what's going on in those regions if you're working there, but there's going to be plenty of places where you'll find no work happening at all once you get down to the province and district level. And finally, there are a couple of regions, North Africa and Europe and the Americas, that have very little work at all for a variety of reasons. In Europe and the Americas, there are a lot of obviously unreached diaspora peoples that could be engaged, as well obviously as the majority Europeans and Americans. North Africa, there's significant logistical and security issues, obviously, but this is an area that has very, very little work going on. So in total, we have roughly 12 million believers in movements in Africa, 52 million believers in movements in Asia, 2.5 million or so in Europe, and 1.2 million in North and Latin America both. So we can see the preponderance of the believers are in Asia and Africa, but a not insignificant number are in Europe and Northern America as well. So yes, some stunning progress around the world. 1% of the world's population are in rapidly multiplying movements, and this 1% is concentrated in areas that are very unreached. And yet, for all of this phenomenal activity, we have not yet quite tipped the needle. The unevangelized world, the unreached world, is still growing faster than our efforts to reach it, and we still need to see a lot of workers in places where there is no work right now. I believe that for all of this progress, we really need to see the global church still step up even more and begin to collaborate together to send workers into places where they have no workers. And I really hope that you who are watching this video will see the enormous opportunity and the enormous potential, and yet the enormous need as well, and will add your efforts to the efforts of Africans and Asians and Europeans and Malaysians and Indonesians and Singaporeans and all sorts of people around the world, where we really can see the whole body come together to bring the whole gospel to the whole world. I don't believe that's just a trite expression. I believe that's what it's going to take to see the Great Commission finished, which I believe is possible. So I thank you for listening to this video, and hope to collaborate with you in the future and hear from you the enormous and wonderful and awe-inspiring things that God is doing amongst the unreached.